Welcome to another edition of the Time for Impact podcast with Chris Wade and Matthew Cobble. In today's podcast, we talk to Gemma Richards and Julia Manser from the West Glamorgan Regional Partnership, and we talk about their experience of getting the agencies in their area to collaborate around effective volunteering. In particular, we explore the opportunities of passporting volunteers from one organisation to another without the usual bureaucracy of joining each organisation. I hope you enjoy. Here's the podcast. So the Time for Impact podcast is all about innovation and creativity. It's all about celebrating anything that Matt and I find across the sector that we think is really innovative and that the rest of the sector can learn something from. So we like to talk to organisations, whether they're big or small, local or national. It might be commercial organisations, charitable organisations, heritage organisations, sports organisations. We don't mind. As long as there's something innovative that we can all learn, then we want to hear and learn those lessons. So for today, we've actually got an infrastructure project. So we're hearing from that part of the sector. And the West Glamorgan Volunteering Support Project, I thought was really fascinating when I heard them talk to me about the innovation that they're doing, because it's all about collaboration. It's all about bringing partners across a local area together to think about how we can do volunteering better in a more joined up way than we could as individual organisations. So it's about thinking about how organisations can mobilise those volunteers in a more effective way, in a more efficient way, in a way that makes sense both to the volunteers and to the organisations that they're partnering with. And I think that's really special. And I think that's something that's common to all organisations that we work with. So it's a story we want to hear. And as we get going, I'm sure we're going to touch on that theme that some of you would have read about in the DCMS papers over recent years from Danny Kruger and so on, that theme of volunteering passporting. So that's enough from me. Let me introduce you to Julia Manser and Gemma Richards. And I don't know who wants to go first, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about the genesis of the project, where it came from, what was the impetus behind it, and how it's grown from there.
Well, thanks for your interest and invite. My name is Julia Manser, and I'm one half of the West Glamorgan Volunteering Support Project, and the other half is...
I'm Gemma Richards. I'm working for Neath Talbot Council for Voluntary Service and also the second half of the West Glamorgan Volunteer Service.
This project started really back when in November 2020, Welsh Government advertised a pot of money that was going to be available for multi-sector partnerships to come together to think about embedding learning that had happened through the coronavirus issues and learning from what worked and thinking about what we would have loved to have had at that time to respond better to what was obviously a massive crisis. And volunteers, as everyone knows, were mobilised overnight, and the swarm of people coming forward saying they really, really, really wanted to help was just amazing. And it was trying to match up, wasn't it, at that time, the interest with the roles and also the capacity of organisations to understand how they could mobilise those people. So in January 2021, we started the project because we received the money.
Yeah, so it might be helpful just to tell you a little bit about who the partners are. So across Wales, we've got regional partnership boards, and they've been set up as part of the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. So each region across Wales has to have this regional partnership board, and it brings together the partners with a focus on health and social care. So in the West Glamorgan Regional Partnership, you've got 2 county voluntary councils. So that's the Neath Talbot CVS and the Swansea CVS. You've got 2 local authorities. You've got Neath Talbot Council and Swansea Council. You've then got Swansea Bay University Health Board, and then the West Glamorgan Regional Partnership Team themselves. So there's 6 sort of partners involved in this piece of work. So it is a cross-secretarial kind of partnership, bringing together third sector and statutory services. So the pot of money was called something like the Coronavirus Recovery Grant for Volunteering. And it was about how do we harness the volunteering that took place during the pandemic. How can we work together better as a partnership, and what do we need to do to kind of sustain volunteering going forward?
There was a feeling early on that we were all singing off completely different hymn sheets.
Yeah.
Very early on, it was recognised that the partners understood the term volunteering very differently, but they all wanted to know more about it, what was best practice and how we could all collaborate. I guess the end goal was, wouldn't it have been absolutely brilliant if we were all really best practice around volunteering and we were able to work together and pass volunteers between ourselves and move volunteers quickly where they were needed. There was a real misunderstanding early on. And so we decided we needed to develop some real operational resources that would enable volunteer managing staff within those organisations to all start to sing from the same hymn sheet.
I guess they probably weren't even that clear on what the outcomes, or rather you must have had different views about what the outcomes desired from the project were between the different partners, or was that quite...
Yeah, well, I mean, some directors of services saw that maybe volunteers were the answer to their prayer in terms of budget restraints. Some thought that volunteers were the answers to their prayer in terms of co-production. Some thought that having the community on board to be part of the answer to a crisis was just ethically correct. And some people were already themselves quite committed to volunteering. We started with having discussions about, well, how could passporting work? And we spent an enormous amount of really digging deep in terms of what's stopping us, what are the concerns, what could we work on, do we need agreements, how would we find a solution to that problem? We really drew down to the core issues, and we wrote up some papers after. And the first few months we spent designing 11 toolkits, training that organisations might be able to pick up and tweak themselves, but gave them a kind of format for good quality volunteer induction. We had an animation about, what is this crazy thing called volunteering? A really interesting first 3 months.
Yeah, so other than, the whole suite of resources we developed, and I suppose those resources were important as a way of sustaining volunteering in the future, because it was about how do we, use that resource that organisations could just access later down the line. So the resources, the toolkits, the information sheets, the training, those sort of resources were one part of what we did with that coronavirus recovery grant. The other was really focused on those regional ways of working. So, those very top level kind of discussions about what do we need? How can we, prepare ourselves if there was an emergency in the future? How could we possibly get to that situation where we could maybe pool volunteers together differently? So we did have those conversations, as Julia said, around the passporting. What we found with that particular piece of work was it might work well for smaller organisations. The medium-sized sort of organisations were okay about a passport in, but were a little bit like, the volunteers would need to have some level of training which was consistent and, needed a bit more detail around that. And then we looked at like the large national organisations where it became a little bit more complex because they've got their own sort of standards in place then. But there was appetite, certainly from the 6 partners involved in the West Glamorgan Regional Partnership, to explore it a little bit further. So we started looking at, okay, so maybe not volunteer passports as we know it, but what about volunteers for one-off events? So we looked at what that process might look like. So it could have been the county voluntary councils had a pool of volunteers, and if there was a one-off event, say, I don't know, a music festival, a cultural event or something like that, where we needed quite a large scale number of volunteers to support it, what would that process be? So it would be a case of, has that organisation got a volunteer policy? Have they got insurance in place for volunteers? What's the risk assessment look like? What sort of training do these volunteers need before we, signpost them over to you? So we started having those discussions. And then the main conversation was about that strategic approach to volunteering. There was an appetite really to develop a volunteering strategy for the region. And not a very ambitious strategy, but a strategy nevertheless that says we are going to commit to having these strategic conversations about volunteering. We are going to sign up to a set of principles which follow good practice. Because if ever we want to get to that situation in the partnership where we want to pool volunteers together for maybe a future pandemic, hopefully not, or, some other sort of emergency situation, there has to be some level of consistency across our volunteers. So we're doing a lot of work at the moment in working with each of the partners, sharing good practice, looking at different mechanisms to collect data or measuring impact, volunteering impact. And once we get each partner to some sort of consistency themselves, then we can start thinking about, well, what does that look like as a partnership? We did trial what this could look like through an accelerated recruitment, volunteer recruitment for one of the mass vaccination centres.
No, I have to say, I've been on your website and it is a treasure trove of information, and I'd encourage everybody listening to go and have a look. We'll put the links in the show notes. You mentioned the animation, but there's so much more on there: training resources, videos, volunteering principles, some real examples and tools that others may be able to explore if they want to work in partnership in a consistent way in their own local area.
Julia, Gemma, can I ask a quick question on, I guess, this kind of balance of innovation? I think one of the things that I found really interesting as part of the experience of being someone involved in volunteering during the pandemic was that it seemed to be that sort of overnight, lots of organisations basically kind of ripped up the rule book. So the kind of changes that we've been, that were taking years to make, they were being made overnight on people's kitchen tables, and they were, we were making decisions in days that would have took months and months. And, there was this kind of latent ability to really transform the way volunteering happened at scale and pace. And it took these very extreme circumstances to bring that about. But nonetheless, it brought about change and innovation. I'm interested in whether, it sounds like what you've been saying is that, you experienced a lot of that and were able to open doors for that in your organisation. Do you feel you've been able to sort of sustain that in a sort of, in the world as it is today, or do you feel things have gone back again? Or how do, one of the things Chris and I are really interested in is how we find space for more innovation. What advice would you give to people to kind of keep innovating? How can you find the conditions for that alongside trying to run volunteering programs in a more conventional sense, I guess?
I think working in partnership has really helped to be able to trial some of these ways of working. Of course, when we did the accelerated volunteer recruitment with the health board, there was that level of safety checks, making sure everyone was clear about who was responsible for these volunteers. but there was also some level of trust because the health board knew us as organisations, and they knew that the volunteers that we had on our books would have gone through proper induction training. They would have filled in an application form. They would have had reference checks, DBS, if that was appropriate for the role that they were in.
I wonder if there's quite a local element to this as well, or to do with the size of the organisations. Matt and I have both worked for fairly large organisations, and whilst there's a desire to collaborate, harder to turn those big juggernauts of organisations around and flex the way that you volunteer in them and the procedures that you use in larger organisations than it is for smaller ones. And I wondered if you had any advice for organisations, large or small, in how they can compromise and align their activities so they can work better in partnership.
I think collaborating with the councils and the health board has done the CVCs a world of good. They knew we were good, but in times of terrible worry, we stood up and we were really counted. And I think they will remember that as terrible budgets come to pass, and that the statutory sector is being mindful of every penny. I think the third sector, if it can collaborate with the statutory sector and show them where we are best placed to deliver service, where we can transform services in a slightly different way, where we have the expertise to utilise volunteers, to have the community in the heart of the solution, not seen as the problem. I think that's the kind of collaboration that we all want to see. And coming back to one of your points about, do we think this has been sustained? Have times changed? I think they have. What's really interesting, of course, at this time is the crisis within volunteering, which is the complete antithesis of what we saw during the pandemic, where there were so many volunteers we were falling over them. And maybe it kind of is indicative of volunteers being able to sustain that kind of involvement for shorter bursts. And we're having to rethink right now what volunteering looks like in 2024. It's not what I anticipated when we were going through all this in 2021, 22. We thought volunteering would grow from the experience as people had their first tiptoe into volunteering. We thought they would begin to walk through it and run through it, but some of them escaped out of it. And we're still unpicking what that is about. I think we're still learning. I think what we'd probably, say is that the collaboration we undertook within West Glamorgan Volunteering Support Project has led to a place now where the individual partners are themselves doing better volunteering. And so that has sustained.
I think it's really interesting, like talking about kind of the response of people and sort of comparing that to the situation today. Like my view, I'm very much an optimist. I'm very much a sort of believer in people, and I do really think that part of this is sort of a challenge for us to unlock as a sector, which is like there is latent demand out there. People do want to give their time, and they do want to help each other, and they do want to help their communities. And it's kind of on us, right, as volunteer involving organizations to work out like what those conditions are that make that possible, I guess. But like sometimes we're really guilty of kind of designing opportunities that look and feel a little bit like jobs. and are sort of run and delivered a little bit like jobs, and lots of people are doing jobs already, and so those jobs are very difficult to fit in with the rest of their busy lives. And sort of how we can, look at society today, understand, how we can make it as easy as possible for people to give their time, is something that feels like should be a responsibility of all of us that work in this area. And it feels like some of the work you're starting to doing is really making kind of big strides to that, because I imagine some of this stuff is not always the big complicated stuff that we might imagine it is, but some of it's the kind of frustrating stuff, like that kind of stops people in the first place. Like, how can we make the forms we fill in easier? How can we make it so that people don't have to duplicate the training they've already done elsewhere? How can we make things like collecting references easier, or whatever? Clearly we want volunteering to be safe, but we also need it to be like easy and accessible for people, so it's kind of seamless and removes the barriers. I don't know, and it feels like you've done some great work in moving that forwards. It's really impressive.
One of the things that we seem to be finding, and that we found throughout this project, was how volunteers in these times require more power. They are not, I've been working in the CVC for 20 years. I've been here for 20 years. And there's a big change in what volunteers, the commitment the volunteers made, how long they stayed there, what kind of way they expected to be managed. And so I would say, volunteers now would like to help design their own roles, would like to have some more input into the contribution they're making, that they're not necessarily wanting to volunteer every Wednesday, and that they want their lived experience to be utilised in a positive way. They want to be recognised for their skills. And we found that some of the volunteers that were involved within the partnership let us know that during this period of time, let us know that they really wanted to be supported, yes, managed, perhaps didn't like that phrase. They wanted to be recognised. They wanted to have, that kind of, that power over their own contribution. It kind of feels like there's a bit more of a change in that kind of aspect of volunteering.
Absolutely, and that comes through clear, of course, in, for instance, the time well spent research and the vision for volunteering. But we don't always see that research and that thinking come through in practice. So we all need to work much harder at it, don't we? Gemma, Julia, I wonder if we were to ask you to give a 3-point manifesto to other organisations about the things they need to do to change the way they work in collaboration with other agencies, including the councils, and how they can foster better passporting and sharing of volunteering throughout the area. What would those 3 points be?
Looking at some of the learning, certainly from the accelerated volunteer recruitment activity, I would say, when you're going into these partnerships, it has to be built on some level of trust and a good understanding of each other. So building those relationships are crucial. Secondly, I would say, be clear about what the ask is, so really, have a good understanding of, what does this actually look like, what would be the roles for, what would be the appropriate roles where you share volunteers, who would be responsible for those volunteers, whose insurance would they come under, whose policies, but then also looking at those scenarios when things go wrong, how would you deal with those situations? If there was a safeguarding concern, is it the organisation the volunteer is volunteering with at the time, or do they have a duty to share that with the organisation that they're pooling the volunteers together with? Just really think about those practicalities of when things go wrong as well.
Data is one of the issues that we are still struggling to move with, and in an ideal world you need all of the partners to be collecting the same sort of basic data so that you can say, I've got 20 volunteers who've all done safeguarding level 1 in the last 6 months, who've been DBS checked in the last 6 months, who have got references that were done a year ago, have got similar experiences from roles they've done in our organisation. And that kind of data needs to be consistent between the partners. So data for me is a big one.
In terms of tackling that, I also wonder about the challenges of different organisations using different volunteer management systems, different data sets for recording their information. What kind of challenges does that pose for you?
Well, let's be clear, and it won't be the same in the third sector, volunteering involving organisations, but some of our partners were not centrally collecting data at all. Even if it was on a central spreadsheet, that wasn't being done. So there wasn't a data set on any kind of management system. And lots of organisations do not have volunteer management systems. Some of them do have spreadsheets or their own staff system, which has been expanded to add volunteers on as a kind of add-on.
Been there.
For this kind of approach to work, ideally you'd all have the same management system, or a way that was quite easy to just draw that data, but just having the same data fields. The rest of it, I think, is quite easy to sort out. I mean, if you're talking about sharing hundreds of volunteers to another organisation that has hundreds of volunteers, you probably do need the same volunteer management system, because that kind of admin nightmare would just be too difficult. But if you're talking about an organisation sending, up to 50 volunteers over for a crisis situation, then I think as long as you have the data, you trust each other's data collection, you trust that each other as an organisation reviews things, and that your admin is pretty tickety-boo, then I think that's the main thing to worry about.
Have you got to any impact measurement or anything? One of the things that the sort of Kruger report started to talk about was this social covenant stuff and trying to understand kind of measuring social benefit of volunteering. Have you been able to measure any of that, or have you seen anything interesting around that with your programme?
When Julia and I started this piece of work, because we were both seconded from our usual organisations to the regional partnership team to take this work forward, and we delivered a presentation in one of the big board meetings. And this is the very question that a lot of the directors wanted to know. How are we going to measure the impact? How are we going to know what difference we have made? And our answer at that time was very much, we probably could get a couple of case studies together to, show some good news stories of how it's made a difference. But at this point, at that point in time, it was really difficult because we had no data, and it's really hard to, measure the impact when there is no data to measure. So there's obviously lots of recognised ways of calculating the economic value of volunteers. So once we know how many volunteers we've got around the partners and, what sort of hours they're doing, then there's, quite an easy way of calculating the economic value. But there's so many other contributions that volunteering has, which are less easily defined in monetary terms, really. So looking at things like social cohesion, inclusion, economic regeneration, development of social capital, they're all different things, isn't it? And we are still quite a long way from getting anywhere near able to measure those sort of things. But one of the things that we did really recognise was how we needed to get those top people in the partnership. So you're looking at the directors, the heads of services, those with the strategic kind of responsibilities to really understand the value of volunteering. We had an external facilitator, very experienced facilitator, Eileen Murphy, to come in and do a training session with the big people from the partnership, just to get them to understand this is actually what volunteering is. It's just crucial. You want to add value. You want to think about the volunteers' well-being and how they can improve their well-being, which will obviously take a lot of pressure off health and social care services later down the line. But they really did need to understand the value of volunteering.
It feels to me like there is a real nice kind of two sides to the equation there, if you want to put it that way, of going, okay, here's what you need to put in to create value here, but here's what you're going to get out on the other side. And I think sometimes that's like how we think as a sector, again, about having those conversations to show and demonstrate the impact of volunteering, I think is so important, because I think, there is still a sort of, I still bump up against, this idea, as I'm sure you do, that, volunteers are essentially free, or a free resource or free labour. It's kind of more sort of challenging perceptions of that. And like moving into this space where actually we kind of really understand this kind of really powerful potential in people that is there, and we can unlock it and realise the benefits of that if we make the right investment, and if we channel that and support that in the right way. And again, I suppose the challenge to some extent is on us, right, as a sector, a little bit, to go, how do we make that case? How do we make that argument? What are the things that we know about that other people aren't seeing, that we need to show and demonstrate to people about kind of the real change that these kind of pieces of work make for people and society? I think it's so exciting, and I feel like I see it, but not everyone sees it. And
that's really interesting, Matt, because one of the partners in our partnership project, the Health Board, they've had long-term high investment in their volunteering, and they're doing everything really, really great. They've got staff on it. They've really been doing it this well. And as one of the partners, they were able to share how they measure impact in pounds and hours saved in terms of nurses, or in terms of prevention of falls, or in terms of all of these lovely tangible hooks that directors of service wanted to kind of be able to know from their own organisations. And they were able to show, yes, you can get that kind of information out, but only after many years of putting that data in and of doing the groundwork. Now they're reaping the reward. Of course, people want that on day one. They want that kind of evidence of impact on day one, but they don't see that there is lots you have to do before you can draw that out. But when you do hear those kind of maths, when you do hear that kind of oh my God story, that data that hits you is really, really powerful. And you realise that volunteers, yes, it's about the community being involved, but there is that kind of monetary value as well, and everybody wanted to hear about that. But we are also really, really keen to get those quotes from the nurses, as we did at the vaccination centre, saying we couldn't have done it without them, or I didn't even know that volunteers could do that. Those kind of things we've done case studies where we've had made videos. There was one younger woman who was a student volunteer who we matched up with a gentleman who spoke a language that nobody in his nursing home spoke. He hadn't spoken his mother tongue for 20 years. He was desperate in his old age to come back to that. And we matched a volunteer up with him, and he started to shower, and he started to shave, and he started to really pick up because he was able to talk to somebody and meet with somebody who he could talk about. She was making him cakes that his mother used to make him, and it made a huge impact on his well-being.
Reminded of a quote I heard about this kind of stuff once, and I'm afraid I don't know where it came from, so I can't attribute it. I can't claim any credit for it. But this idea, and it stayed with me a lot when I think about this kind of stuff, which is the idea of kind of no data without stories and no stories without data. Like you need both of those things to be convincing, to move people. You kind of need to move their hearts and move their brains at the same time. And, to do this stuff well, we need to deal in the data stuff, which can be hard, quite requires our systems, can take time to set up. But we also can't forget about the stories and capturing those stories as well, and capturing the things that sometimes we might take for granted in our world that we, or our charity or our organization or wherever we are, that we see regularly, that can almost become kind of normalized a little bit, but these things aren't normal, and capturing those things and using them to illustrate that impact is really key.
One of the big pieces we've done last really has been around lived experience volunteering. We've really seen a growth in that. So while some people say that, there's this problem with volunteer recruitment, there's a massive growth in lived experience volunteering. And, the impact that sharing your story can have on others that are going through a similar issue, the kind of truth that comes from that kind of wisdom within volunteering that no professional in the field of, substance misuse can sound as truthful as somebody that's used substances and knows how that feels and the challenges. Lots of stuff around, mental health, the power of people supporting as peer mentors others that have got a similar diagnosis on the road to recovery. We've really enjoyed kind of unpicking the specific benefits and challenges of lived experience volunteering within this project as well. There's been so many spin-offs, and we're left with a 14-point principles document and a resource library which hopefully shines a light on all of these wonderful twinkly stars.
I think we could talk for hours, couldn't we? There's so many great, as you say, spin-offs from this, the benefits, but also the way that the journey has taken you and maybe will take you in the future is fantastic. And I'm so pleased that we invited you onto the podcast, because I really do honestly think what you're doing in West Glamorgan is something that certainly other regions, but I think other charities and organisations really should be taking note of and learning from. And we'll put your strategy website and your toolkits and so on our notes for the episode, if that's okay with you, so others can have a look. And I'm sure on there is also how to contact you if they have any questions. But it's been
the good thing about our sector is we share, isn't it? We're not precious. We share all of our lessons learned and resources.
Yeah, and that's what makes us great. And today's episode was very much about collaboration. So it'd be a shame if we said we weren't going to share, wouldn't it? So,
so not in the spirit.
We'll put all of that on there, and just want to say thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experience. So that was Julia Manser and Gemma Richards, Matt. Well, what do you think?
Wow, I thought that was really interesting. Lots to reflect on there. I think things that we can probably all learn from a little bit. So I was interested in their sort of approach to collaboration in particular. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned there around getting a kind of committed group of partners together. And it seemed to be kind of something for me in there potentially as well about kind of finding the space and the funding to innovate, and that being quite important. I don't know what you thought about that, Chris.
Yeah, well, I just thought it was a great lesson. I mean, clearly both have got huge amounts of experience in volunteering anyway, regardless of this project. And I thought they've found a real vehicle to bring that together, as you say, in a collaborative way, but to use both their volunteer management experience, but also their partnership experience and their kind of negotiation experiences, maybe with funders and other partners to turn it into something really, really practical and really action focused in terms of putting that into value rather than, you know, just talking about it. So I thought it was brilliant. And you and I have both looked on the website and looked at all the tools and things that they've developed, which, you know, are often, you know, quite practical things. But as this starts to develop, and I've no doubt they will be successful in bringing in more local partners and expanding this to get volunteers in a position where they can volunteer right across the region. I'm sure there'll be a brilliant success, and I really do encourage people to look at what they've been doing and see what they can learn in their own regions or their own organisations. I wondered, Matt, whether there's also something for us beyond the local in terms of lessons to be learned around maybe bigger organisations, understanding the importance of relaxing some of their bureaucracy or doing things slightly different in different parts of the country, where there's benefits of collaborating in this way. And I know it's very difficult if you're a big organisation to say we'll do something different in Glamorgan than we'll do in Grimsby, but actually the benefits that can be gained from thinking outside the box and collaborating and sharing in this way, I think outweigh the risks. We just need to find a way of breaking through that.
I think one of the things that really struck me is they've clearly spent a lot of time trying to really understand kind of the rules of engagement around this stuff. You know, they were talking about really trying to develop really high quality, consistent volunteer journeys, for example, and really mapping that out, really understanding it. And this kind of case of like knowing the rules so you can know where to break them a little bit more or be more flexible with them in a kind of, you know, I mean that in a kind of conventional wisdom kind of sense, is something perhaps we all need to think about a little bit more. You know, what are the things we're actually really confident in, and how can that give us a bit more confidence to maybe try something different? You know, the moment we think we've just cracked it and got something right is maybe also the perfect opportunity to go, right, now what can we do differently? Although that might feel a bit exhausting after a while, but finding the time to do that could be one of the best points for some of that innovation potentially.
That's what a podcast is all about at the end of the day, isn't it? It's about hearing innovative ideas from innovative people. I should say, as always, that we're keen to hear from other people who think they've got some creativity to share for future episodes. And there's a way of getting in touch with us, which is podcast@timeforimpact.co.uk. So if you have ideas of either your own projects or other people's that we should be hearing from, please do send those ideas through to us. In the meantime, please do subscribe to the podcast so you can hear from our future guests as they come along, and hopefully they will inspire you to new ventures in your own volunteering practice in the future.